The news flashed across the screen. Dr. Julian Thorne nominated for the Kepler Prize. My heart stopped. In the lab, I listened to the hum of the servers and knew I had proof he stole my discovery. Tonight, I'll show you how I turned silence into a reckoning. Receipts, data, and the name that belongs to me. Thorne Particle. If you believe in karma, hit that like button and subscribe. My name is Dr. Thorne, and for most of my life I have been a ghost. Not the kind that rattles chains, but the kind that writes the masterpiece the world praises someone else for creating. My laboratory is my sanctuary and my prison, a place where I uncovered the secrets of the universe, only to watch my father, the celebrated Dr. Julian Thorne, present them to the world as his own dot. The world I live in wears its victories like medals pinned to a coat. The lab sits at the edge of a sprawling campus, glass and steel catching the sun in perfect arithmetic, as if even the walls were trained to applaud. The hum of machines is a constant lullaby, an orchestra of cooling fans and the soft tick of hard drives that sedates the nerves when the mind tries to wander into the place where a person's name should sit on a chalkboard of certainty. In that hum, in that glow, I am both the safe harbour and the locked door. He was the sun. I was the shadow he cast. My father is not a villain, not exactly. He is charismatic, the kind of man who can make a room lean in closer with a smile that seems to solve equations merely by existing. He leads the university's physics department with a confidence that looks like sunlight poured through stained glass, warming, blinding, inevitable. They say the funding comes in the family, his name, and I hear it in the way the words land like a verdict and a blessing at once. Your time will come. Be patient. Patience was a discipline I practiced the way a violinist practices scales, until every note born of restraint sounded like inevitability. I was patient while he published my dissertation on quantum entanglement, under his name as the lead author. I was patient when he won the National Medal of Science for my research into dark matter, a project I conceived and executed while he was on a 6-month speaking tour, a tour that felt orchestrated to keep the world's gaze from blinking away long enough to notice who was truly in the frame. I was the ghost in the machine, the unnamed variable in his equation for success. I let him do it because I believed him. I believed that one day he would step aside and let my work shine on its own dot. That belief began to wear thin the day I learned what belief costs when it becomes a currency you never get to spend. It was a cold Tuesday in November, the kind of day that makes the campus look asleep under a sigh of wind. I was running a simulation, the supercomputer's fans a patient chorus, the screen bathing the room in a pale electric blue, when a news alert flashed across the terminal. Dr. Julian Thorne nominated for Kepler Prize. The sentence hit me like a strobe in a dark corridor. Hard, sudden, undeniable dot. The Kepler Prize is the Nobel of Astrophysics, people whispered, in the spaces between coffee cups and conference rooms. The article that followed spoke in one breath of a groundbreaking discovery, a new subatomic particle that supposedly unifies two fundamental forces of nature. They called it the Thorne Particle. The world never learned to read it as a ghost story, yet the subtitle read like one. The article carried a clip from a television interview, a mirror held up to a man who looked every bit the image of brilliance, polished and precise. "It's rather embarrassing, actually," he said with a practiced, humble smile. The entire concept came to me in a dream. A dream. A pile of sleepless nights, a map of notes, a lab bench heavy with the weight of a truth I had trembled over and protected as if guarding a lightning rod. He had erased my years of work, my moment of pure, unadulterated discovery, and replaced it with a bedtime story. The lie was so audacious, so complete, that it didn't even hurt. It was a catalyst. The ghost in me finally solidified, and she was furious. I didn't confront him. I didn't scream or cry. I did what I do best. I gathered data. For the next 3 weeks, I meticulously compiled every piece of evidence. Time-stamped lab notes from my personal server that sat like quiet sentinels in a corner of the network. Original data files with metadata proving their origin, tucked in folders whose hashes were gospel. Emails I had sent him, explaining that breakthrough step by step, and his replies, which read, "Interesting, let me think on this," before he presented it as his own a week later. Meanwhile, the world kept turning as if nothing was amiss. The laboratory lights did not flicker in sympathetic grief. The hallway banners did not ripple with the tremor of a storm about to break. But inside me, there was a new weather. It began as a tremor you learn to ignore, a whisper that says, "Wait." It grew teeth the way a river cuts through rock, slow and sure, until the line between belief and truth dulled to a soft, trembling edge. Then the next choice arrived, wearing a different mask. I accepted a senior research position at a rival university, leaving behind the cages of the old lab's expectations to step into a place where the air felt sharpened, the bar higher, the sky somehow closer. I submitted a proposal to speak at the annual Global Symposium of Physics in Geneva, the same conference where my father was scheduled to be the keynote speaker and unofficially accept his Kepler Prize. The move wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was a careful, precise step in a geometry I had drawn in my head for years, divergence, then a clear path toward light. I used my mother's maiden name, Vance. It was not a childish trick. It was a deliberate renaming that allowed a heartbeat of credit to echo back to the woman who raised me with quiet hands and a stubborn belief that the book of a life should be written in the writer's name. It was time she got some credit, too. The day of the conference, the auditorium was packed. The warm glow of the lights washed over the crowd as my father stood on stage, soaking in the adulation of our peers. He finished his speech with a thunderous, standing ovation, a king addressing his court, the audience leaning in as if to hear the formula for every future breakthrough etched into his voice. Then it was my turn. I walked to the podium, a small, unknown woman following a titan. I began my presentation calmly, outlining my new research, the follow-up work that was already years beyond his stolen discovery. Then I paused. "But to understand where we are going," I said, my voice ringing clear and steady through the silent hall, "we must first be honest about where we began." I clicked to the next slide. On the giant screen behind me, an email appeared, my email to him, dated 3 months prior, with the subject line, "Eureka! I think I've found it." Beside it, his dismissive reply. A murmur went through the crowd. I clicked again. A screen grab of my server's logs, showing the original simulation data, time-stamped 72 hours before he ever mentioned the particle in a department meeting. The data spoke for itself, unembellished and exact. I presented it with the same dispassionate precision I used for my research. The murmurs grew into a roar of whispers. Phones came out, recording. The Kepler Prize committee members in the front row wore faces that looked like rain clouds about to break. I never once looked at my father. I didn't have to. I could feel the heat of his humiliation burning a hole through the stage. The ghost had finally shown herself, and she had brought receipts. The fallout was immediate. The Kepler nomination was rescinded before the day was out. An ethics investigation was launched by the university, and his career, built on a foundation of my work, began to crumble into dust. I now lead my own lab. The particle is officially known as the Thorne Particle in every textbook and academic journal. My father has not spoken to me since that day, but I don't need him to. I spent a lifetime waiting for his validation, only to realize that the only validation that matters is your own. I am no longer a ghost, no longer a shadow. I am the scientist who stepped out of the dark and into the light. Have you ever had to fight to take credit for your own work, your own ideas? Tell me your story in the comments below. The days after Geneva moved like smoke across the campus, the silver-haloed kind that soothes the eye while seeping into the memory and settling there, stubborn as a stone in the shoe you pretend not to notice. People spoke in terms of "he's recovered," "she's stepping back into the light," as if the whole affair were a misstep in a dance rather than a fracture in a spine. I watched the world pretend to resume its own momentum, while I learned to measure time by the knock of a mail slot rather than by the clock on the wall. The breaking point didn't come with a fanfare. It came with a quiet, tedious letter, delivered by campus courier, slipped under a door that never closes all the way, because the corridor's soundboard is always vibrating with meetings and grant, reports and the soft surgical whisper of a new rumour that travels faster than photons through a fibre. The letter was stamped with the seal of the university, but the handwriting inside wasn't a professor's elegance. It was a lawyer's cold script, the kind that makes even the air feel premeditated. The envelope bore a name I'd learned to recognise from years of subtle erasure. The Thorne Institute. Not my name, not my work, but the monogram that could still draw a crowd in a room full of eyes trained to worship the invention more than the inventor. I opened it as one would open, a trap, slow and careful, so that the moment of discovery could be postponed just long enough to pretend it wasn't real. Severance and transfer agreement. IP rights, foreground and background data, authorship and patents all in one neat cold package. The Thorne Particle, which in my own heart should have stood as a beacon for the honest, stubborn work of a single person, was to be rebranded, redistributed, repackaged into a shiny new product, to be marketed under the brand of a centre I could not name without feeling the sting of a hand on my throat. The terms were precise. I would sign away the claim to my own discovery, to my own labour, to the very breath that sparked the thing I had built from nothing but fever and patience. In exchange, I would receive a stipend, a seat at some conferences, a chance to play the game that once tried to swallow me whole, a game I had already played and refused to lose again. The moment I read the line about continuity of research and dissemination under the umbrella of the Thorne Institute, the room seemed to tilt. The hum of the machines in my lab, their patient, steady breath, fell away, becoming a single naked point of sound, a nervous tick, a clockwork whisper, the echo of a door that had closed on me once before and would close again if I let it. The words blurred for a moment, and then sharpened with a brutal clarity. This isn't about a prize or about me as a ghost stepping into the light. This is about ownership of every inch of ground I have fought to reclaim. I read the page again, as if the truth could fold itself into a different shape if I studied it long enough. The data I had managed to preserve, time-stamped logs, hashes that proved the origin of the breakthrough, the chain of custody that kept every molecule honest, was not a shield here. It would be a bargaining chip, a line item in a ledger, and the ledger would be balanced in favour of people who did not tremble when a discovery veers toward your name and then shoots past you, like a comet that leaves your fingerprints on the glass and then slips away. In that moment, the final straw fell into my palm with the dull, inevitable weight of metal hitting stone. If I signed, I would hand back to the world a version of myself that could be displayed in lectures, reformatted, narrated and repackaged for mass consumption, while the real, raw, messy thing I had built, the stubborn core, would belong to the system that pretends to illuminate the world, but actually curates what is allowed to shine. The script would be rewritten, my voice relegated to footnotes, and the Vance name would become a gloss on a broader story that didn't include me at the centre. I folded the letter, not in defeat, but in a sort of clinical mercy I rarely permit myself. The treaty was a trap, and I would not walk into it with the same shoes that once dragged me along the edge of a stage I never asked to inhabit. I stood at the window of my new lab, the campus lights bleeding into the night like ink spilled across a map. The river outside did not rush to deceive itself with the idea that it could be a road. It simply kept moving, faithful to its own gravity. And I understood then that I would not be the river that erodes the rock by accident, nor the rock that stands there unyielding while the world passes by. I would be the stream that carves through stone by design. The breaking point was not a scream. It was a sentence you realise you will not memorise. The breaking point is the moment you choose not to sign away your own name. I called the courier back, spoke with a clerk who still believed in the quiet virtue of patient questions, and I asked for time. I asked for the truth to be weighed with a different scale. I asked for a room where I could lay out a plan that would not depend on a benefactor's mercy or a board's calculus. The clerk sounded surprised, almost frightened by the calm in my voice, the same calm you feel when you stand on the shore while the sea collects itself for a storm you know is coming. The storm inside me was not a frenzy, it was a careful, cold vow. I walked back into the lab and cleared a corner of the whiteboard, such a plain thing that had once been a battlefield. I drew a circle, then a line, then a name. The circle became a plan, a network of independent labs, a consortium that would give credit where credit is due, not where the power to grant it happened to lie. The line became a route: open data, open collaboration, transparent authorship. The name: Vance, finally, not as a ghost or a brand, but as the memory of a mother's stubborn belief that a life should be written by the writer who lived it. The breaking point did not break me. It coaxed a fire into the quiet, a resolve that did not shout but settled. And in that stillness, I realized the final chapter had not closed on a scandal or a credit dispute. It had opened into a new kind of pursuit, the kind you chase with patience, the kind that requires no permission and offers no absolution except the one you grant yourself when you finally sign your own name to your own work, again and again, on your own terms. The storm had taught me to listen, not to roar. It now whispered in numbers and timelines, in the tremor of a keyboard, in the measured click of a phone dial that did not tremble when the words leaving my lips could redraw a life I had rebuilt with my own 2 hands. If the breaking point had been a sentence you refused to memorize, the strategist in me, awakened perhaps by a late-night coffee and the quiet growth of resolve, took up its own language. Balance sheets as maps, risk as weather, and people. As the weather's true measure. I sat with the whiteboard again, the dried exhale chalk drawing a pale crescent on the glass, and I let the plan unfold like a procedure that would not tolerate emotion as a variable. The first calculation was brutally simple and, in its simplicity, devastating. What would it cost to sever the supply lines that fed this work? Every stipend, every line item, every token of faith that had kept me tethered to a system that, in its own way, loved the spectacle of field-changing discovery more than the stubborn act of living with its consequences. I opened a secure file and began tallying the output, the inputs, the overhead that had always felt like a friendly ghost until it turned into a chain around my waist. The burn rate, I decided, would be the first heartbeat in this new economy. The lab needed people, the ones who believed in evidence more than prestige, and those people needed salaries, benefits, safe spaces to think and to fail and to try again without a boardroom sigh over their heads. There were 9 of us in the core team, 2 postdocs, 3 graduate students, a technician, a data specialist, a safety officer, and an administrator who kept the machine humming with logistics and patience. They weren't merely names, they were a living argument against the idea that a discovery can survive on the breath of a single name or a loan grant. I counted their annual stipends, their benefits, the grad student stipends that the university billed as part of the cost of training the next generation of scientists, the insurance for the lab, the service contracts for the spectrometers, and the cryo benches and the backup servers that never slept. The numbers were not kind. If I pulled the plug today, there would be a cascade. In 60 days, the university grant pool would run dry, and the department would be forced to pause new hires, curtail travel, and push the lab into a historical footnote as a case study in how not to monetize a rebellion against the status quo. But if I did not pull the plug, the trail would wind around a larger trap. The dependency that the Thorne Institute counted on to prove its own relevance, the corporate partnerships that measured value in press clippings and quarterly reports, the donor funds that nourished the myth of a single saviour who could deliver a miracle in one laboratory and then vanish into the bright glare of tenure and conference circuits. I computed the longer horizon, the 3-year window the agreement dared to pretend would be a stable economy for a field that preferred the discipline of alarms to the discipline of contracts. The numbers, though ugly, formed a line. The core, burn of personnel about $1.6 million. Equipment maintenance and energy around $350,000 annually. Travel and dissemination another $290,000. Contingency and risk reserves perhaps $120,000. It was not a figure anyone would celebrate, but it was honest. The Vance particle had always been honest in its own way, a stubborn discipline in a world that liked to polish the edge of its knives. The first revelation, as inevitable as the river meeting the dam, was that severing the funding would not simply stop the science. It would rewrite the geography of the field. The Vance name would become a cautionary tale about a genius who walked away from the gravy train and found a different riverbed, one not funded by a campus marketing department, but by a network, a consortium of independent labs, a scattering of small grants, a stream of data that flowed between open repositories and shared notebooks. The cost, then, was not just the salaries, but the loss of cachet, the volatility of credit, the risk that a world accustomed to a silver-helmed origin story would forget the code that made the thing work in the first place. But I did not turn away from the cost. I set the numbers against a different ledger, the ledger of future autonomy. If cost was the price of independence, the question became, what else would we gain? The answer lay in trust, in the reallocation of power, in a system where no single name could own a discovery by accident of fate or by the stroke of a sponsor's pen. The consortium would not be a rebellion against knowledge for the sake of chassis and brand, but an invitation to a new culture, transparency in authorship, open data that could be validated by any competent peer, a ledger that kept the chain of experimentation honest in a way a single glossy press release never could. The second calculation was the emotional and ethical bill, the damage to the relationships that had made this place feel at times like a home. I was no longer the person who believed in the myth of the unstoppable individual, but a strategist who believed in a different myth, that a field grows when it learns to distribute risk, to reward collaboration over solitary heroics, to allow the stubborn core to keep its voice even as the world asks for more voices. If I severed the funding, I did not vanish from the story. I reappeared in a new form, a director of a different kind of stage where the spotlight belongs to a chorus, and the solo is earned by the strength of the ensemble. With the numbers in place, I began the work of dialing. The first call would be to the institution that had become, in practice, the closest thing to a financial god over the last few years, the university itself. The campus CFO would have to hear the truth in its full, unsparing form. I rehearsed a script that sounded soft, but was a blade in a velvet sheath. We are restructuring the research landscape to prioritize independent open science. We will not be accepting new disbursements from the current lines of support that require a predetermined direction for publication or for credit. We will, however, reopen conversations about a neutral funding model that does not tie the hands of the researchers. The truth's edge was that I did not pretend this was temporary or a polite renegotiation of a few budgets. It was a fundamental pivot. I would not allow myself to be a hostage to a system that insisted the story be about the sponsor's needs rather than the truth's. The first ring was answered by a voice that knew the sound of numbers, not the whisper of a vow. The CFO had a ledger in her mind that clicked into place as I spoke, pausing only to confirm the accounts and the timeline. I spoke of a clean disengagement, the winding down of any grant that had a narrative direction requiring a single author, or a club of gatekeepers to approve every line that left the lab. I asked for an immediate pause on any new disbursements and a review of all multi-year commitments, with a staged wind-down plan that would preserve the team's dignity and avoid layoffs if at all possible. Her response was measured, professional, and restrained, the language of a chess player who believes the game is worth finishing even when the move is painfully pure. After that call, I did not feel triumphant. I felt the tight, careful ache of a plan becoming real. The next calls followed in a different cadence, to the Thorne Institute, to the sponsor who had once whispered about the Vance advantage in glossy brochures, to the corporate liaison, whose job it was to weigh a partnership in dollars and public image. The Thorne Institute's voice tried to wrap the moment in a velvet glove, offering a softer landing, an exit strategy, a transfer of the data, a promise to maintain minimal support for ancillary equipment in the short term. I listened, and I refused. The bargain was not to be a mercy mission, it was to be a clean break, a break that would not shatter the people left behind, but would not let the old hands rewrite the ground rules in the name of continuity. Asterisk the donors, 2 or 3 who had the stubborn belief that science could still be saved by a single spark of generosity, were a different risk altogether. Their calls came with a mixture of fear and curiosity. If you found a way to keep the data open, to publish the method with a transparent chain of custody, Perhaps we could pilot a modest fund dedicated to open science infrastructure, one said, with a kind of hopeful skepticism that suggested more hunger than money. I listened to the language they offered and then offered my own counter-proposal: a distributed endowment, a non-profit shell, a volunteer governance structure, a platform for sharing data and credit in perpetuity. It was a possibility, not a promise, and their questions asked for a future I could not yet name. Meanwhile, the lab world did not stop, not entirely. Students who had believed in a future here asked about their positions, their summers, their opportunities to contribute to something larger than the next grant cycle. I reassured them in the ways that someone who believed in the truth could reassure. The work would continue, though the shell around it would change. There would be a shift in how we tell the story, yes, but not in why we wake up and stare at the same glass-eyed instrument and think the same stubborn thoughts. Can a discovery be owned by a person who made it, or is it owned by a community that cares enough to protect its innocence from the market's hunger? The numbers kept telling me what I already knew. The price of independence was far steeper than the price of submission, but the cost of submission had always been the same: timidity masquerading as responsibility, a quiet surrender of one's own name to a ledger that could be rebalanced any day by people who never built what I was building in the first place. If I was to carve a future where the work remained uncentered in a single ego, I would have to learn a new kind of patience, a patience that did not recoil at the long horizon, but welcomed it as a friend. The river that once seemed to be a road now showed its true nature. It was a current, a continuous force that needed a route, a plan, a map that could survive the storm and still kiss the shore with something new and unspoiled. In the end, I did not press the end button on the conversation. I pressed a different button, the one that would open a door to a room that did not yet exist in the university's architecture, a room of our own design, with its own ledger and its own ethics. I would call again in the morning, and the morning after that, and I would keep dialing until every last thread of financial support, university, institute, donors, vendors, was tuned to the same quiet, stubborn rhythm. We are building something. By design, not by permission. The first steps would be small and careful, the first phone calls precise and unyielding in their courtesy. It would be a season of severs and starts, a season where the strategy did not pretend to be noble. It was simply the method by which a living thing refuses to be pinned to a wall with a label and chooses instead to root itself in a soil it can cultivate with its own hands. And as I hung up the last line I dared to call that night, the whiteboard reflected back to me a new map. The Vance Circle, not as a boundary, but as a circle of collaborators, a line that did not end at a contract, but threaded into a broader possibility. The numbers, now laid bare, no longer terrified me. They steadied me. The calls, though uncomfortable, did not fracture me. They named a future, not as a gift from someone above, but as a grant I gave to myself. The consent to be both the engine and the steward of what I had grown, to bear the weight of the consequence, and to carry it forward, not as a martyr, but as a strategist who learned the only trick that matters in a field that never stops asking who truly owns the moment when a breakthrough becomes a legacy. The strategists among us learn to count what matters and to call the next number before fear can rearrange the digits. Tonight, I called for the first time, and the river, still and patient, answered by opening a new channel, one that would not erase the old water, but would guide it toward a different coast. The night after the calls, the campus settles into a light hush, the kind of hush that comes when the air is a thin blade rather than a storm. I walk the walk that threads the old library arc with the newer glass wings, the night air tasting faintly of rain and coffee and equations that still won't sleep. The university breathes, and I listen for the difference between a whisper and a threat. It comes as a chance encounter, an ordinary corridor, a chance turn, a voice I thought I'd learned to measure and shelve. Eleanor sits in a corner cafe lit by a single bulb that trembles with the hum of a fridge somewhere in the kitchen. She looks smaller than the person I remember, but the eyes haven't changed, sharp, memorizing, calculating. When she sees me, she nods as though this reunion belongs to no one else but us two. I wasn't going to intrude. she says, a half-smile flickering. But the night has a way of speaking in whispers when a report won't tell the truth. Slide into a booth that has the right amount of isolation and heat, enough to keep words from drifting to the wrong ears, not so much that we feel watched by the world. I order the sort of drink pilots toward a late-night confession and listen as she speaks in that precise, almost clinical cadence I recognise from years of shared seminars and brutal post-mortems. You were right to try to sever the leash, she begins, leaning in just enough to make the air between us real. But there's more you didn't see, not because you were blind, but because you were already flying the other way. The betrayal runs deeper than the money. I let the words settle, the way a storm settles into the body of a river before turning a bend. Elena's eyes don't blink. She's learned to be careful with every syllable, to dial down the tremor in a voice that could wreck a room if it carried the wrong charge. She tells me she left the lab not out of fear of the unknown, but because she had begun to see the certainty of something she couldn't name, the way the lab's narrative could be shaped to fit an image instead of truth, the way an open science pledge could be used as a mask for a closed-door negotiation. She shows me a folder she carried in a leather satchel that has seen better days, a handful of papers, a printed email thread, a notebook with marginalia in her careful hand. "Look at this," she says, pushing the notebook toward me. It's a scavenger's map of the lab's life over the last 18 months, time-stamped and cross-referenced. The handwriting is hers, the dates painfully exact, the margins crowded with observations she hadn't had the nerve to publish ** in the margins, of a memo about a grant extension. She found a line she hadn't noticed before, a phrase that looks like a throwaway, but lands like a detonator. To appear consistent with the Thorne Institute's strategic narrative, the Vance work will be curated to emphasise the partnership. She points to a string of calendar entries, a date when a certain line of data was to be rotated in the public presentation, a moment when a preprint would be released with a carefully circumscribed set of figures, a moment when a single author list would be presented as the outcome of a team rather than the effort of a community. Not all of it is manipulation, she says, voice soft but unyielding. Some of it is simply the slow corrosion of a truth under the weight of a story that sells, but there are traces. The data you'll want to look at, the real trail, has nothing to do with the grant numbers. It lives in the data lineage and the access logs and the way the instruments were used in the months leading to the wind down. Her next words arrive not as a confession, but as a warning disguised as an invitation. There's a deeper betrayal, she says. Someone inside the administration, someone who knows the data better than most, saw an opportunity to own a narrative, to own a discovery, to own the moment when a line in a paper could become a headline. They spun a thread that pulled your work into a corridor where you couldn't see the exit, and they used the wind down as cover to obscure the trail. She mentions a name I had not expected to hear spoken so casually in a campus bistro, a senior administrator who has shoulder-deep, carved into the lab's governance, someone who can present a soft public face while quietly directing the private channels, contractual, data, publication, everything that can be orchestrated behind a velvet rope. The name is not a revelation, so much as a cold confirmation of something I already knew in the marrow. The betrayal is not merely financial, it's epistemic, a deliberate misdirection of trust. Elena slides a second document across the table, a single page, a fragment of a memo with redacted lines that would suffice to prove a pattern if the words were laid bare. There are two key sentences, one that hints at neutral funding models, the other that hints at privileged access to open data infrastructure in a way that would translate into power rather than knowledge. The kind of power that could dictate not just what is published, but what can be seen as legitimate, what can be stored in an approved repository, what can be cited, and by whom. Why tell me this? I ask, though I already know the answer. It's not malice that propels her to speak. It's a stubborn insistence on the truth, as the only durable currency in a field that has learned to measure value by press cycles as much as by experiments. Because you're not leaving your own. Story behind you, she says. You're building a new kind of ledger, but you'll need eyes beyond your own for the next chapter. If you're going to fight for an honest map of results, you'll need intelligence, raw, unpolished, and risky as hell to handle, and you'll need people who won't blink when the lights tilt. Asterisk. We talk until the hour leans toward dawn, until the cafe staff vanish in shadows, and the first pedestrians stand out from the building skeletons. When we finally stand, I pocket the 2 documents with care, not as spoils, but as assignments. The my. Next morning, the morning after the night when I made the decision that the river would carve a new channel, I begin the intelligence gathering. The language of this part of the plan comes to me in that same calm, careful voice I've learned to trust. I will find the grain of truth in a field of noise. I will trace the footsteps through the labyrinth. I will keep the team protected even as I pull back the curtain. First comma, mapping the data lineage. Eleanor's notebook becomes a guide in spirit, if not in detail. I assemble a line chart in my head, a path from bench to publication that includes every detour. Appendices that were added after the fact, code commits that whisper about a change in method, parameter tweaks that shift a result by a margin that could be used to argue for different interpretations. The data specialist and the technician will be the first to walk that line with me. We will inventory datasets, version histories, and the chain of custody logs that show who touched what and when. We will cross-check against the lab's own open notebook commitments and the institution's data-sharing policies. If there is a mismatch between what we promise to the world and what the data actually contains, we will know it. Second comma, the procurement and access trails. Elena's references point to the cryobenches, the spectrometers, the service contracts, and the vendor invoices that sometimes seem to run parallel to the life of a grant rather than beneath it. I will talk to the administrator with a careful stance. No accusation, only questions that demand documentation. I will request a complete ledger of all equipment acquisitions, maintenance cycles, and service visits since the wind down began. I will compare shipping times and grant milestones to see if there are correlations that suggest a covert alignment between a vendor's schedule and the lab's narratives. If I see patterns, I will treat them as data points rather than suspicions. Third, the listening tour of the lab community. The 9 people who have given so much, the 2 postdocs, 3 grad students, the technician, the data specialist, the safety officer, the administrator. I will speak with each of them not as the I, person who might have betrayed them, but as the person who intends to protect what they built. I will ask open questions. I will listen for slips. I will note what remains unsaid and why. If someone knows something but fears to voice it, if someone has seen a corridor light go on at 2 a.m. and wondered who was walking, then I will listen for the tremor in the voice that reveals a truth more potent than any rumour. Fourth, the external node, the open data world. Eleanor's insinuations about a neutral funding model and an open platform will require verification beyond campus walls. I will seek out independent auditors, data security consultants, publishers who have championed transparency, and a small network of peer labs who operate under the same creed of publish widely, verify openly, credit the collective. If there is a crack in the armour, I want to see it clearly, hear it in the cadence of the dialogue, watch how it echoes through the repositories and the preprint servers. Fifth comma, the ethics of the edge. I will write down a personal charter for what I will not do in order to pursue the truth. I will not retaliate through official channels with accusations I cannot prove. I will not leak or weaponize data to fit a narrative. I will protect the people whose lives have been tangled with mine, even as I pull the skeletons from the closet. I will hold to the line that the goal is not simply to catch a betrayer, but to recover a method that the field can trust again. My risk is not merely professional, it is moral. The act of gathering intelligence will itself be quiet, no dramatic confrontations, no sensational finds in the first week. It will be slow, patient and honest, each document a footprint, each conversation a trace. And somewhere in the corridor of those footprints and traces, I sense a truth that is bigger than any single revelation. The work we built does not belong to a sponsor or an institution, not to a board or a single author, but to a community that remembers why we lift our eyes to the lab in the first place. It belongs to the people who will one day stand on the shoulders of what we learn here and see farther, with fewer shadows, because we finally decided to count what matters, data that can be accessed, results that can be replicated, and a story, told in a way that refuses to pretend the river is only a road when it can be a current that refines the coast. Elena's words haunt me, but not as a haunting to frighten. They come as a map, a tool, a warning. The betrayal is not a final verdict. It is a signal flare, asking me to sharpen the lens, to widen the frame, to align the compass with something truer than the next grant cycle or the next press release. The work will carry me through this season of sievers and starts, but it will not end with a single act of discovery. It will end only when the ledger, our ledger, records what we chose to defend. The integrity of method, the shared glow of open science, and the stubborn conviction that a truth worth pursuing cannot be owned by a person, a sponsor, or a rumour, but only by the truth itself, when it is seen by many and held to the light by many more. I walk back to the lab with Elena's documents tucked into my coat, like a map that may never be fully read, but will always guide the next step. The morning air is sharper, but there is a quiet, persistent warmth in the spot where the river begins to bend. The circle, the Vance circle, feels less like a bond and more like a doorknob, turning toward a room we have not yet described, a room we will design together, with a floor of data and a ceiling made of trust. I am not angry. I am not exhausted. I am listening, finally, to the intelligence around me, the intelligence all those who came before us laid down in experiments and calendars and code, and I am ready to gather it, to test it, to use it to illuminate the path that leads us not away from risk, but toward the courage to face it openly, with our names intact and our work intact, our integrity intact, and our future intact, together. By late afternoon the next day, the documents felt heavier in my coat pocket, like weights I kept there to remind myself not to drift. Eleanor watched me with that unblinking clarity she always carried when the room tried to take a life of its own. We met again in the same corner cafe, but now the table held a stack of printed emails, the redacted memo, a ledger of screenshots, and a single, spare note from the open notebook, the marginalia I'd learned to trust as a map, not a weapon. Social. And legal attack, I say to her, letting the words slide between us the way a skater glides along a thin sheen of ice. If we don't speak to the community first, we'll be accused of secrecy. If we speak too late, the data could be buried beneath a different story. Elena's lips quirk at the corner, not a smile exactly, but a recognition that we're stepping through a door we cannot unstep. We start with the ledger made public, not the ledger locked away, she says. We show what we have. Data lineage, access logs, the time-stamped edits, then we invite an independent review. If the tower echoes, it's not our chorus that fails. It's the structure that didn't deserve the chorus in the first place. We draft a plan that feels almost surgical in its restraint. Step 1. Social disclosure. We craft a one-page public memorandum to the department, the college, and the open science community. It will not name individuals in a way that could invite defamation suits, but it will lay bare the patterns Elena identified. The rotation of data in presentations, the selective release of figures, the chain of custody that becomes a faint, fragile line when you tug at the end. It will be a call for transparency, for an independent audit of data practices, for reaffirming the institution's commitment to open, verifiable science. The aim is to invite dialogue, not to scorch the earth. Though we know the flames will find their own fuel. Step 2, preservation and inquiry. We file a formal preservation notice to the university's General Counsel, the Office of Research Compliance, and the Data Governance Committee. It's a quiet act, a legal heartbeat that says, do not alter, do not destroy, do not hide. The SIGA notice will request a full independent review of data lineage, access controls, and the wind-down implementation, specifically the months leading up to the wind-down, so that nothing slips beneath the door while eyes are turned away. Step 3. The external and internal audience. We will approach the Thorne Institute and any other funder who touched this project with a carefully worded disclosure, a summary of concerns, a timeline, and a request for an independent review of the grant's administration and the integrity of the data produced. At the same time, we will approach the campus's auditor, the Internal Affairs Committee, and the university's Ethics Office with a request for a joint, transparent inquiry, an opportunity to restore trust if the facts support it, or to name the betrayals plainly if they do not. Step 4. The community gathering. We propose a town hall, a venue chosen not to judge but to illuminate. We request a panel, students, postdocs, technicians, a neutral data science advisor, and a representative from the independent auditor. We will read from Elena's notes, but only enough to anchor the public's attention to the verifiable data. Then we will release the data as open, step by step, with a live demonstration of how lineage and access logs expose the architecture of a project as it moved from bench to publication. Step 5. The legal line. We'll commission a letter from a lawyer who handles research integrity to be sent to the university's council and to the funder's oversight office. The letter will not demand heads, not yet. It will demand a rigorous, timely process of investigation and the protection of all data and personnel involved. It will articulate a potential breach of contract and governance duties if the data were manipulated or selectively reported to fit a narrative. It will outline remedies, an order to halt any further data changes, a requirement to preserve all relevant backups and logs, and a timeline for corrective actions. It will insist on interim safeguards until the inquiry is complete. We know the risk. The social piece could provoke a defensive lullaby from those who prefer the old tune, the one where integrity is a slogan rather than a practice. We know the legal piece could unsettle people who believed the wind down was nothing more than bureaucratic necessity. But Elena's evidence, our ledger in human form, needs a public face and vocal support. If the world hears the exact cadence of the data's journey, perhaps they'll trust the destination again. That night, we gather the circle. There's the data specialist, whose eyes compute in real time and who has watched the lineages bend without breaking. The technician, who knows exactly which dials and knobs on the bench recently sang a different tune the nights the wind down grew loud. The 2 postdocs, who carried the weight of late-night questions and the fear of what happens when a field's memory is co-opted by a sponsor. The safety officer, who remembers the lab's risk register and the whispers behind the doors that claim nothing to see here. And me, who learned long ago that testimony without a chorus becomes a rumour that rots at the root. Elena stands at the edge, a quiet centre of gravity, not guiding the group so much as ensuring the ground remains steady as we incline towards something dangerous and necessary. We'll move in stages, she says, the words almost antiseptic and precise. Public disclosure first, then a legal preservation stance, then the inquiry. If they push back, we push harder, but we push with the truth we can stand behind. Even as we lay the plan onto the table between us, the campus begins to respond. In the days that follow, the first ripple arrives in the form of a memo from the department chair. Curt, careful, non-committal. It promises a scheduling of a listening session, a commitment to evaluate and respond within the established procedures. It's the smallest possible nod in a sea of disbelieving eyes. The next ripple comes from the Graduate Student Union, whose members circulate a petition drawn from Eleanor's margins and the data logs. Demand for an independent data audit, insistence that the university publish a path to retraction and correction where necessary, and a public commitment to open science principles. It is not a victory speech, but a chorus beginning. Then a stronger wave. The Office of the President issues a measured statement about procedural integrity and the university's duty to X, Y, and Z without naming names. It's not a concession, but a door ajar, a sign that the institution sees the threat not as personal assault, but as a systemic fracture that could gnaw at all the work that comes after. Through it all, I feel the river bend again, not away, but toward a new channel, the channel Elena tipped us toward the night we met, the channel that the ledger itself now demands. The legal letters do not promise vindication, they promise process, and process with teeth. The social act does not guarantee triumph, but it promises accountability and the possibility that the field will remember and repair. In the quiet of a late afternoon, after the campus has absorbed the first wave and before the second crest, Eleanor and I walk the wind-down hallways where the world's shadows hide in the corners of the glass. The instruments hum with cautious electricity. The air carries the scent of coffee and ozone, and the faint, stubborn hope that a community still remembers why it built the things it builds. Are you afraid? I ask her. Not because I doubt the plan, but because fear is a stubborn anchor. For honest work. She shakes her head, just enough to be persuasive, a scientist's denial. Fear is a catalyst, she says. If we're careful with what we reveal and how, fear can become courage. The community will decide what it wants to protect, the sponsor's narrative, or the method that makes the truth legible again. I nod, and we step into the corridor, where the light is thin, but the truth is thick. The next moves may be heavy, the consequences significant, the battles long, but the ledger is no longer a private thing tucked away in a coat pocket. It is in the open, a map drawn for the very people who will one day stand where we stand now and ask the questions that matter, not to condemn, but to understand, and to demand that what is learned be learned rightly. If the river must bend, let it bend toward a coast that can bear the tide, one that makes room for the data, for the voices, for the work, for the shared glow of open science. Let this be the moment when the room, our room, tells the truth not as a rumour, but as a responsibility fulfilled, and let us be the ones who held fast to that responsibility long enough to see it become something the field can hold up, not as a trophy, but as a covenant. You own your discoveries. You publish them with their flaws laid bare. You invite scrutiny. You protect those who measured and mapped and repaired, and you do not let a single name obscure the method that makes the truth accessible to all who would seek it. The door to the next chapter remains open. We push through, not with a shout but with a careful, undeniable step, and the river, once bent toward a single purpose, begins to teach us a new current. Not the force that forgets, but the current that remembers, and in remembering, makes the work possible again for everyone. The checkmate did not arrive with a shout, but with the careful, unanswerable click of a gavel and a slide deck that refused to blink away from the truth any longer. The town hall that afternoon looked nothing, like a battlefield, and everything like a courtroom that had finally remembered its duty to every susceptible heart in the room. The panel, 3 professors, an auditor, a student representative, sat in a line that could have been a church pew, and the crowd before them hummed with a nervous, almost reverent energy. Elena stood a step behind the lectern, her presence, less a command and more a gravity that pulled every distracted thought back into orbit. The first data slides flickered into view. Data lineage mapped in a sequence of bright ribbons. Access logs that showed the exact moment a file left one hand and joined another. Timestamps that walked the edge of every figure, presenting a map so legible you could trust the path even if you could not trust the people who walked it. I watched, the room lean in. The antagonist, Dr. Calder, the sponsor's most practiced smile, attempted the opening gambit of every decoy. A chorus of soft absolutions, a suggestion that perhaps the public misread the wind down, an insinuation that we were chasing ghosts. Elena did not raise her voice. She slid a single page across the podium, no flourish, a clean sheet of paper that bore only a line from her marginalia, a reminder that the thing most worth proving is not what you find, but how you allow others to question it. The page landed in the arms of the chair, who held it as if it were a fragile artifact. Then came the smoking gun. A series of emails, confidential, then deliberately circulated to the room, that revealed a chain of decisions designed to conceal the most damning passages of the data. Not conjecture, not rumour, but a documentary thread that traced the wind down back to its earliest, most purposeful edits. Calder's team had tried to rewrite the narrative by choosing which figures to highlight and which to obscure, all under the banner of closing a project responsibly. The auditors' voices rose with the gravity of a courtroom, calm yet inexorable, confirming what Elena and I had suspected in the coffee-stained margins of a notebook. The integrity of the work had not merely been bent, it had been broken into pieces, then shuffled for appearances. The room exhaled as one. It was not triumph so much as a long, necessary exhalation after a storm. The chair spoke first, not to condemn, but to acknowledge a truth no one alive could ignore any longer, Governance had failed, and it would be rebuilt in broad daylight. The university's board announced an immediate pause on any further wind-down actions, a restructuring of the data governance framework, and the appointment of an independent oversight body with a mandate to monitor ongoing research programs across all departments. The funder, first quiet, then suddenly exposed, agreed to suspend any new disbursements while an external review proceeded. Calder's orbit began to fracture in real time. Colleagues withdrew support. Reputations repelled him as surely as gravity pulls bark from a dying tree, and a cascade of negotiations with law firms and media outlets began to leak the contours of the affair to a public that would soon understand what had happened. The checkmate was less a single move than a sequence of unavoidable consequences. The wind down, once presented as a necessary courtesy to a fading project, would be halted, and re-examined as a breach of fiduciary duty in at least 3 jurisdictions. The Internal Ethics Office announced a parallel inquiry, while the campus auditors prepared a public report. The postdocs who had feared being a footnote suddenly found themselves quoted in interviews as witnesses to process, not casualties, of it. The data specialist became more a steward than a technician, guiding the institution toward an infrastructure that could be trusted even if people failed it. The technician, too, found work not in troubleshooting the old regime, but in mentoring others on how to guard against the very things that had tempted their elders to cut corners. After the hall emptied, Eleanor and I walked the quiet corridors that smelled of solvent and rain. The river outside our town had shifted its own course over the months, no longer a reminder of what one could lose, but a guide toward what could be saved. We spoke of the future in quiet voices, the kind of talk that doesn't announce itself to the world, but to the part of you that remembers the night you chose to tell the truth and learned how to endure the consequences. In the weeks that followed, the antagonists' lives began to recalibrate around the new orders. Calder's name drifted from board meetings into private settlements, and eventually into a whispered memory that no one dared quote aloud. The Sponsors Foundation rebalanced its portfolio toward independent verification, and the Institute, that had funded the wind down, reoriented its mission toward open, auditable science. It felt like watching a system cough up the last of its dust and then dare to breathe again. For me, the shift was not a victory parade but a doorway. Elena and I stood at the threshold together, and the river's cadence, steady, patient, insistently, forward, guided us. We did not abandon the field. We rejoined it with different shoes, with a map that was no longer a complaint but a plan. The new dawn arrived not with fireworks, but with the simple act of waking in a room that had learned to be honest with itself. I found a small house by a quiet harbour, where the mornings came with a bowl of sun, and the kettle sang to the rhythm of a data-driven world that valued transparency as a first principle. Eleanor took a role that let her build apprenticeships in data governance and public accountability, turning margins into a curriculum and margins of error into teachable moments. We published a joint manifesto, open by default, auditable by design, and compassionate toward those who feared the consequences of truth. We spoke little of the battlefield and much of the garden we would tend together, a field that remembered how to be curious, how to be careful, and how to welcome every voice that could help us grow taller, straighter, and kinder. The checkmate had changed the board, but it had not changed the game's heart. The river that once bent toward a single shore now widened into a coast where the work could endure, and where the truth, learned, contested, and finally owned, could be carried forward by more hands than simply ours. And in that shared dawn, I found not the end of a struggle but the beginning of a new life. A quiet, confident future, where the work endures and the people who carried it through are not erased by the sound of a closing door, but remembered. In every transparent line we publish, and in every honest step we take together. If this story gave you chills, smash that like button, and subscribe for more stories like this.